Welcome back to Before Common. Everything around you has a secret past. Today we are going to uncover one of them. The history of tea we take always. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is doing something so ordinary they will forget it within minutes. They are pouring hot water over a small bag of dried leaves. Steam rises. They do not think about where it came from. They never do. But that cup of tea in their hand once made an empire go to war. It once got an entire nation deliberately addicted to a drug. It once pushed a group of colonists to hurl crates into a freezing harbor rather than pay a tax on it. And in 1848, it turned a mild-mannered Scottish botanist into a spy. His name was Robert Fortune. He shaved the front of his head. He braided a fake queue into his hair. He put on the silk robes of a Chinese mandarin, a disguise that could get him executed if anyone looked too closely. Then he walked straight into the forbidden interior of China, territory no Westerner was legally permitted to enter, hunting something far more valuable than gold. He was hunting leaves. Because by the time Fortune took that walk, tea was not just a drink. It was the thing an empire's entire economy quietly depended on. And China held the only key. To understand how one plant did all of this, we have to go back nearly 3,000 years, to a story that starts not with a spy, but with a myth pretending to be history. If a story like this deserves your attention, this is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to dig up. Subscribe to Before Common now because the next twist in this one will surprise you. Chinese legend says tea was discovered by Emperor Xinneng in 2737 BC. The story goes that his servants were boiling water for him to drink when a few dried leaves blew in from a nearby tree. Curious and famous for testing hundreds of herbs on himself in the name of medicine, the emperor tried the accidental brew. He liked it. It is a clean story. A tidy story. It is also almost certainly not true, at least not literally. The text that records it, the Xinnong Ben Chao Jing, was written long after Xinneng supposedly lived, likely by scholars trying to give an ancient practice a suitably ancient founder. The real story is messier and stranger because the real story is written not in legend but in dirt. Wild tea trees grow naturally in the misty highlands of Yunnan and Sichuan, in southwest China. Long before anyone wrote the word tea, people living there were almost certainly chewing or brewing the leaves as medicine, not pleasure. The earliest credible evidence of this points to the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years ago. But medicine for a few is not the same as culture for millions. For that, archaeologists needed something rarer than a legend. They needed proof. They found it in a tomb. In the mausoleum of Emperor Jing of Han, buried near the ancient capital of Xi'an more than 2,100 years ago, researchers uncovered something that made headlines around the world. Charred remains tested and confirmed as tea. Not a story about tea. Not a poem about tea. The actual physical leaves, buried alongside an emperor, meant to accompany him into the next life. Think about what that means. This was not a casual drink. This was something an emperor's court believed was worth carrying into eternity. And it did not stay in one place. Tea from Han China turned up alongside silk in a tomb in Gari, deep in western Tibet, carried there along a branch of the ancient Silk Road historians now call the Tea Horse Road. Chinese tea traveled outward in exchange for something the Han Empire desperately needed. Horses. War horses, to be exact, for an empire constantly threatened on its northern and western borders. A leaf traded for the animals that would decide the outcome of battles. That is how seriously this plant was already being taken, 2,000 years before Robert Fortune ever put on a disguise. By the time of the Tang dynasty, tea had stopped being just a commodity. It became something closer to a philosophy. A man named Lu Yu, orphaned as a child and raised inside a Buddhist monastery, wrote an entire book about it. The Cha Jing, the classic of tea. It was the world's first manual dedicated to a single beverage, covering everything from the correct water to the correct state of mind while drinking it. Buddhist monks embraced tea for a very practical reason. It kept them awake through long hours of meditation. And through those monasteries, tea culture spread further than any emperor's army ever could. That is how, in the year 805, a monk named Aisha carried tea seeds out of Tang China and back home with him to Japan. 10 years later, in 815, Aisha did something that would be recorded as a historic first. He personally served tea to Emperor Saga of Japan. It is the earliest documented instance of tea being consumed on Japanese soil. At first, it belonged only to the powerful. The imperial court drank it. Buddhist clergy drank it. Ordinary people did not. Over the following centuries, that changed and changed profoundly. What started as an imported medicinal curiosity slowly transformed into something uniquely Japanese, a ritual of precision and stillness that would eventually become the tea ceremony, a practice built entirely around the idea that pouring a drink for another person could be an act of respect, humility, and art. But while tea was becoming philosophy in the East, it had not even reached most of the West yet. That was about to change, and when it did, it would not stay peaceful for long. Dutch traders were the first Europeans to bring tea home in meaningful quantities, in the early 1600s. It arrived in London a little later as an expensive, exotic curiosity. In 1660, the English diarist Samuel Pepys tried it for the first time in a coffeehouse. He wrote it down simply. A cup of tea, a China drink of which he had never drunk before. He did not even bother to record whether he liked it. Within a few decades, that indifference had turned into obsession. By 1800, tea was the single most popular drink in Britain, consumed by aristocrats and factory workers alike. During the brutal economic hardship of the 1840s, British workers were sweetening cheap tea with milk and sugar just to get enough calories and energy to survive punishing shifts. Tea was no longer a luxury. It was fuel for an empire's entire working class. And that created a problem so serious it would eventually start a war. Every single leaf of it came from one place, China. And China would only accept one form of payment, silver. Britain was draining its own treasury to keep its population caffeinated, and the math simply did not work. So the East India Company came up with a solution that was as brilliant as it was monstrous. If China would not sell tea for anything but silver, Britain would create a product the Chinese population could not resist buying instead. Grown in British-controlled India, shipped in by the ton, sold with full knowledge of what it would do to the people who used it. Opium. Within years, addiction spread through Chinese port cities like a fire with no wind to stop it. Families were destroyed. The Chinese government watched a domestic crisis spiral completely out of control, and finally the emperor had enough. Imperial officials seized more than 1,000 tons of British opium in the port of Canton and destroyed nearly all of it, dumping it into the sea in front of British merchants who watched their profits dissolve into salt water. Britain's response was immediate: warships. This is not an exaggeration or dramatic license. Britain went to war with China, in what history now calls the First Opium War, essentially to protect its right to sell an addictive drug in exchange for tea leaves. China lost. Badly. And the peace that followed was not peace at all. It was humiliation, forcing China into deeply unequal trade terms, and in retaliation, China slapped punishing new tariffs on the tea it exported to Britain. Tea prices in London spiked. British merchants panicked. An empire that had gone to war to protect its tea supply now found that supply more expensive and more uncertain than ever. If you think this story cannot escalate any further, wait until you see what the British East India Company decided to do next. Make sure you are subscribed to Before Common so you do not miss exactly how far one country was willing to go over a leaf. The East India Company had one option left, and it was almost unthinkable. Stop depending on China entirely. Grow their own tea on their own soil, using stolen Chinese knowledge, and they knew exactly who to send to steal it. His name, as you already met him at the very beginning of this video, was Robert Fortune. In 1848, the company handed Fortune an assignment that read like fiction. Travel into regions of China explicitly forbidden to foreigners. Learn the closely guarded secrets of tea cultivation and manufacturing that the Chinese had protected for centuries. And smuggle out live plants, viable seeds, and the skilled workers who knew how to process them, all without getting caught, arrested, or killed. Fortune shaved the front of his scalp. He wore a false braided queue sewn to blend with his own hair. He dressed in the flowing robes of a Chinese Mandarin official and practiced the mannerisms carefully enough to pass. His traveling companion and translator, a man recorded only as Wang, would walk ahead of him at each stop, loudly announcing his arrival to distract from any inconsistency in his disguise. Historians studying this expedition later called it, without exaggeration, the greatest single act of corporate espionage in history. Fortune traveled deep into the mountains of Zhejiang and Anhui provinces, regions where any Westerner caught wandering could face imprisonment or worse. He infiltrated working tea factories disguised as a curious Mandarin official, walking straight past workers who had no reason to suspect the truth. In one factory, accounts describe Wang supplicating dramatically at the gates while Fortune stepped inside, calm, watching every stage of the process most Westerners had only ever guessed at. He watched how the leaves were withered, how they were rolled, how they were fired and dried. He learned, for the first time in the Western world, that green tea and black tea were not different plants as most Europeans assumed, but the exact same leaf, simply processed differently. It was a secret that had been sitting in plain sight for centuries, hidden only by the fact that no outsider had ever been allowed close enough to watch. He did not stop at knowledge. Fortune packed thousands of live tea plants and seeds into custom-built glass cases, an early greenhouse technology that kept them alive during the long sea voyage that would have killed ordinary cuttings. He recruited experienced Chinese tea workers, the only people alive who actually understood the manufacturing process from muscle memory, and convinced them to leave everything behind and travel to a British colony they had never seen. Then he shipped it all quietly toward the Himalayas. The plants took root in Assam and Darjeeling in British-controlled India. Within a single generation, the center of the entire global tea industry shifted away from China, the nation that had grown, perfected, and guarded it for over 2,000 years, and into the hands of the empire that had simply taken it. China's monopoly, protected for centuries, was broken not by an army, but by one disguised botanist and a handful of stolen seedlings. If an empire could go this far over a cup of tea, you can imagine what happened when someone tried to tax it. And that is exactly what happened next, an ocean away. By the 1770s, tea had become so deeply woven into daily life across the British colonies in America that when Parliament imposed a tax on it without colonial consent, it did not feel like a minor inconvenience. It felt like tyranny with a price tag. On a cold night in December 1773, a group of colonists disguised themselves, boarded 3 British ships anchored in Boston Harbor, and in full view of the town, broke open hundreds of chests of tea and dumped every last pound into the freezing water below. It became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with punishing new laws designed to crush colonial defiance. Instead, it lit a fuse. Within 2 years, those same colonies were at war with the empire that had taxed their tea, a war that would end with the birth of the United States. A single plant, grown in the hills of southwest China, traded for war horses, turned into philosophy by a Buddhist orphan, carried to Japan by a monk, fought over by empires, stolen by a disguised spy, and finally, dumped into a harbor as an act of revolution. If a story like this can hide inside something as small as a teacup, imagine what else around you has a past this loud. This is exactly why Before Comment exists. Subscribe now if you want the next hidden history delivered straight to you. Today, tea is the most consumed beverage on the planet after water itself. More than 7 billion kilograms of it are consumed globally every single year, grown across 5 continents, in countries that 200 years ago had never heard the word. In Assam and Darjeeling, the very hills where Robert Fortune's stolen plants first took root, tea is now grown on a scale that dwarfs anything 19th century China could have imagined, employing millions of workers whose entire lives are built around the plant one Scottish spy smuggled out in glass cases. In Britain, the nation that once went to war over its tea supply, the drink became so deeply embedded in daily life that it eventually stopped being a luxury at all, and became something closer to a national ritual, a pause built into the middle of the working day, exactly as it was for the exhausted factory workers of the 1840s who first relied on it to survive their shifts. In Japan, the tea Aisha carried home in the year 805 evolved across more than 1,000 years into a ceremony of extraordinary precision, where every motion, every angle of the cup, every moment of silence is deliberate, transforming a simple act of pouring hot water over leaves into one of the most disciplined art forms in the world. In Morocco, in Russia, in Turkey, in Iran, Tea took root in each culture and became something slightly different every time, sweetened differently, brewed differently, served differently, yet always carrying the same quiet social function it has carried since the Tang dynasty, a reason for people to sit down together and slow down. And in China itself, the nation that first discovered, cultivated, and guarded this plant for over 2,000 years, tea remains not just a beverage but a living inheritance, still grown in some of the same misty mountain regions where wild tea trees first appeared, still prepared using techniques that trace directly back to the very manufacturing secrets Robert Fortune once risked his life to steal. None of the people pouring a cup today are thinking about any of this. They are not thinking about Emperor Jing of Han, buried with tea leaves meant to accompany him into the next life. They are not thinking about monks in mountain monasteries drinking it to stay awake through the night. They are not thinking about warhorses traded for leaves along the tea horse road, or a disguised botanist walking past guards who could have had him executed, or colonists hurling crates into a freezing harbor, or an empire that chose addiction and war over losing its favorite drink. They are simply pouring the water, watching the steam rise, lifting the cup. And that, more than any single event in this story, might be the most remarkable part of all. A plant with this much blood, ambition, and history behind it has become so ordinary, so unremarkable, so completely woven into the background of daily life, that almost no one pauses to ask where it came from. That is exactly how the most powerful stories hide. Not in monuments built to be noticed. Not in headlines demanding attention. They hide in the small, repeated, forgettable moments of ordinary life, in the things we do without thinking, every single day for our entire lives, never once wondering why. A cup of tea does not look like the birth of a war. It does not look like the collapse of an empire's monopoly. It does not look like the spark of a revolution. It looks like nothing at all. And that is precisely the point. That is the story of tea. A leaf discovered by legend and confirmed by archaeology. Traded for war horses. Turned into philosophy by an orphaned monk. Carried across the sea to a new nation. Fought over by empires. Stolen by a disguised spy. Dumped into a harbor as an act of rebellion. And finally, quietly, poured into billions of cups every single day by people who will never know any of this. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden history with us, make sure you are subscribed to Before Common, because this will not be the last ordinary object we prove is not ordinary at all. Everything around you has a secret past. We are just getting started.